Boomtown wasn't always a place where mothers hurried their children indoors at the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Once, it had been the jewel of the frontier, where the glint of gold in the nearby hills drew honest men seeking fortune. Streets that now lay silent after dark had once bustled with commerce, laughter, and prosperity. The Golden Nugget Saloon's doors had swung open day and night as miners washed away their fatigue with whiskey and song. But that was before the Vultures descended. They thought they were targeting just another boom-and-bust mining town along the western frontier. They saw aging shopkeepers, scattered farmers minding their own business, and figured it would be an easy mark to expand their criminal empire. What Gideon Grim Blackwell and his gang of cutthroats didn't realize was that they were sowing the seeds of their own destruction with every act of cruelty they unleashed upon Boomtown. Now the Vultures ruled with iron fists. Their reputation had spread across 3 territories. Men with dead eyes and quick trigger fingers patrolled the streets, collecting protection money from terrified business owners. Those who refused paid in blood. Martha Thompson stood behind the bar of her saloon, wiping the same glass she'd been cleaning for 10 minutes. A woman in her 40s with fire in her eyes that not even the Vultures had managed to extinguish, Martha was one of the few who still refused to bow to Gideon's demands. "They'll be coming back today," her bartender whispered, casting nervous glances toward the swinging doors. "Let them come," Martha replied, setting down the glass with enough force to make her resolve clear. Across town, Sheriff Tom Harlan sat in the back room of the general store, nursing both a bottle of cheap whiskey and the shame of having been run out of his own jailhouse. His badge lay on the table before him, a reminder of his failure. The Vultures had made a spectacle of him, dragging him through the streets before a crowd of horrified onlookers who did nothing to help. Now the jail served as Gideon's personal headquarters, and Harlan couldn't bear to look at it as he passed. "They say the Vultures are planning something big," the storekeeper said quietly, glancing out the window. "Word is they're bringing in more men, making an example of someone." Harlan took another drink. God help us all. But help, if it was coming, wouldn't be from God, at least not directly. As the sun set over Boomtown, painting the dusty streets in crimson, a whisper began to spread. It started with an old-timer in the back of Martha's saloon, his voice weathered but clear enough to catch nearby ears. "You know who we need? We need men like them gunslingers who rode through here years back, the ones who cleaned up Deadwood Junction when nobody else could. Iron Hand Walker, the preacher, that quiet fella they called Whisper." The conversation hushed, but the seed was planted. Martha's eyes gleamed with something that had been missing in Boomtown for too long: hope. By morning, the whispers had grown louder. Some said the legendary gunslingers would return to rain vengeance down upon the Vultures. Others scoffed at such foolishness. But as Martha Thompson gazed out her window at the town she loved falling to ruin, a plan began to form. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're watching from, and if you've ever seen a town transformed by the courage of a few standing against many. Make sure you're subscribed because the showdown that's coming in this story will leave you speechless. The letter was simple, its message direct. Martha's penmanship flowed across the weathered parchment with a sense of urgency that matched the beating of her heart. "Boomtown needs you. The Vultures have descended. For the sake of all we once protected, I beg you to return." She sealed 3 identical envelopes, each addressed to men whose legends still echoed through the frontier. Men who had once brought justice to lawless lands before disappearing into the mists of their own choosing. "You really think they'll come?" Sheriff Harlan asked, his voice a mixture of skepticism and desperate hope as he watched Martha hand the letters to a trusted writer. "They'll come," Martha replied, a certainty in her voice that brooked no argument. "Some debts can never be repaid, and some bonds never break." 500 miles east, Jedediah Iron Hand Walker split wood outside a modest cabin nestled in the foothills. At 62, his face was a map of the frontier, every line earned through hardship and victory. His right hand, rumored to have been shattered and reset with iron, still swung the axe with deadly precision. When the rider approached, Jedediah's hand instinctively moved to his hip where a gun had once rested. Old habits. The only weapon nearby now was the axe. "Jedediah Walker?" the rider called. He nodded once, eyes narrowing. "Letter from Boomtown." The name hit him like a physical blow. Boomtown, a place he'd sworn never to return to. Too many ghosts, too much blood in the soil. 200 miles south, Silas "Whisper" Kane tracked deer through dense forest. His movements were silent as death itself, his breathing so controlled it wouldn't have disturbed a feather. At 55, he was still the deadliest shot in the territories. The postmaster at the nearest settlement had held the letter for 2 weeks before Silas appeared like a phantom to collect his infrequent mail. He read Martha's words without expression, then stared at the horizon for a full minute before burning the letter and walking toward his small cabin to pack. Across the territory in a tiny church on the outskirts of Promise City, Hollis the preacher Boone delivered his Sunday sermon. The congregation listened raptly, unaware that the man speaking of redemption had once been the most feared bounty hunter west of the Mississippi. "For vengeance is mine, saith the Lord," he quoted, his deep voice filling the church. Later, alone in his modest quarters, he stared at Martha's letter, his weathered fingers tracing the desperate words. His eyes closed in what might have been prayer or resignation. 3 days later, when the rider returned to Boomtown, Martha was waiting. "Did you find them?" The rider nodded. "Delivered all 3 letters, but whether they'll come—" "They'll come," Martha whispered, more to herself than to him. As if carried on the wind, word of the letters reached Gideon Blackwell. His lieutenant found him counting the day's extortion money in what had once been the sheriff's office. "Boss, there's talk in town. That saloon woman sent me for help." Gideon's cold eyes lifted. "Help? From who?" "Gunslingers, old ones. Men they say once cleaned up the territory." Gideon's laughter cut through the room like a blade. "Let them come. I'll make legends into corpses." The abandoned church stood a mile outside Boomtown, its weathered cross tilting precariously against the backdrop of a blood-red sunset. Inside, dust motes danced in rays of fading light that streamed through broken windows. The pews had long since been stripped for firewood, leaving only the stone altar as a reminder of more faithful days. Jedediah Walker arrived first, his approach deliberate and unhurried. He sat in the shadows, back to the wall, eyes fixed on the door. His iron hand rested on his thigh, inches from the Colt revolver holstered at his hip. The weapon felt strange after years without its weight, like greeting an old friend who had changed in your absence. When the door creaked open an hour later, Jedediah's hand moved with the speed that had made him legend. He relaxed, but only slightly, when Silas Kane's lean silhouette filled the doorway. The 2 men acknowledged each other with nothing more than a nod. Words had never been necessary between them. Silas took position by a window, removing his rifle from its leather scabbard with practiced ease. His fingers moved over the weapon like a lover's caress, checking, adjusting, preparing. His perpetual silence had earned him the name Whisper, but those who knew him understood his actions spoke volumes that words never could. The tension in the church thickened when Hollis Boone's tall frame darkened the doorway. The setting sun cast his shadow long across the dusty floor, the brim of his hat pulled low over eyes that had once struck fear into the hearts of wanted men. "Iron Hand?" Hollis said, his voice deeper than Jedediah remembered. "Never thought I'd see the day when you'd be sitting in a house of God." Jedediah's mouth twitched. "Never thought I'd see the day when you'd be welcome in one, preacher." The old animosity crackled between them like lightning. Years ago, Hollis had hunted Jedediah for a bounty before they'd found themselves reluctantly fighting on the same side. The truce had never fully resolved into trust. "Martha's letter found you both, I see." Hollis said, removing his hat and revealing hair, now streaked with silver. Wouldn't be here otherwise, Jedediah replied coldly. Silas remained silent, his keen eyes moving between the two men, calculating odds and angles as surely as he would before taking a difficult shot. This town ain't worth dying for, Jedediah finally broke the silence. Not after what happened last time. Hollis ran a finger along the scar that bisected his left cheek. We owe her. I don't owe anyone anything, Jedediah countered. Then why are you here? Hollis challenged. Before Jedediah could answer, the church door opened once more. Martha Thompson stood there, her face lined with worry and lack of sleep, but her back straight as a rifle barrel. Gentlemen, she said quietly, thank you for coming. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Silas, surprising them all, broke his silence. Tell us about these vultures, he said, his voice rusty from disuse. Martha did, sparing no detail of Gideon Blackwell's reign of terror. As she spoke, something changed in the room. It wasn't just about old debts or obligations. It was about justice, a concept that had driven each of these men throughout their lives, no matter how crooked the path sometimes became. When she finished, the three gunslingers exchanged glances. No words were needed. They would stay. They would fight. None of them noticed the young Vulture gang member watching from the hill above the church, who now spurred his horse toward town to deliver news to Gideon Blackwell. Word spread through Boomtown like wildfire. The gunslingers had returned. By noon the following day, the news had reached every corner of the settlement. Some dismissed it as desperate, wishful thinking. Others dared to hope, but all watched and waited with bated breath. At Miller's general store, Old Man Miller counted out coins with trembling hands as two vultures lounged against his counter. These weren't Gideon's elite, just young thugs drunk on borrowed power and cheap whiskey. Seems a bit light today, old-timer, the taller one sneered, pushing the coins back toward Miller. Price of protection's gone up. Boss says troublemakers might be coming to town. Miller's face fell. Please, this is all I have. Business has been slow and... The shorter vulture grabbed Miller by his collar, yanking him halfway across the counter. You calling us liars, old man? Maybe we ought to show you what happens to folks who don't appreciate our protection. The bell above the door jingled. 3 men entered, silhouetted against the harsh midday light. To anyone who didn't know better, they might have appeared unremarkable, just weathered travelers coated in trail dust. But something in their posture, in the way they occupied space, caused conversation to die instantly. Let him go, Jedediah said, his voice quiet but carrying the unmistakable weight of command. The vultures hesitated, exchanging uncertain glances. Who the hell do you think? The taller one began, but never finished. Silas moved with startling fluidity for a man his age. In one motion, he drew, aimed, and fired. The taller vulture's gun belt clattered to the floor, its holster smoking where the bullet had cleanly severed the leather without breaking skin. The shorter thug released Miller and reached for his weapon, but froze when Hollis's voice cut through the stunned silence. Son, the next shot won't be at your belt. Silas here can put a bullet through your eye at 100 paces. We're standing 6 feet apart. Silence stretched taut as a bowstring. Who are you? The shorter vulture demanded, voice wavering. The reckoning, Jedediah replied simply. Something in his tone made both vultures pale. They backed toward the door, eyes never leaving the 3 old gunmen. Gideon's gonna hear about this, the taller one threatened as they reached the threshold. Count on it, Hollis replied, a cold smile crossing his face. Tell him the bill for his sins has come due? The vultures fled, nearly tripping over themselves in their haste. Through the window, the gunslingers watched them mount up and gallop toward the other end of town. Miller came around the counter, disbelief and hope warring on his weathered face. It's really you, after all these years? Outside, a small crowd had gathered, drawn by the commotion. People peered through windows and doorways, whispering among themselves. For the first time in months, there was something besides fear in their expressions. Jedediah turned to his companions. "We've announced ourselves. Gideon will respond with everything he has." Silas nodded once, sliding his revolver back into its holster with practiced ease. Hollis gazed out the window at the townsfolk beginning to emerge onto the street. "Then we'd best be ready." In his commandeered sheriff's office, Gideon Blackwell received the news with deadly calm. His fingers drummed a slow, methodical rhythm on the desk as the frightened vultures stumbled through their report. "So," he said finally, eyes gleaming like a predator's in the dim light, "the legends have come to die." Night fell over Boomtown like a funeral shroud. The streets emptied as darkness descended, an unspoken curfew that had become second nature under the Vultures' reign. Martha Thompson stood behind the bar of her saloon, listening to the rare sound of laughter as townsfolk celebrated the small victory at Miller's store. For the first time in months, hope flowed as freely as the whiskey. "To the Gunslingers!" a miner toasted, raising his glass high. Others joined, the chorus of clinking glasses almost drowning out the sound of approaching horses. Almost, but not quite. The saloon doors burst open with such force that one tore from its hinges. Gideon Blackwell stood in the threshold, flanked by a dozen of his most vicious men. Unlike the thugs at Miller's store, these were hardened killers with notches on their guns and ice in their veins. The room fell silent as a tomb. Gideon moved with casual menace, his spurs jingling with each deliberate step. A handsome man, in a way that made your skin crawl, he wore fine clothes that couldn't disguise the predator beneath. His eyes never left Martha as he approached the bar. "Where are they?" he asked, voice soft as silk and sharp as a blade. Martha's hand steadied on the bar top. "Not here, as you can see." Gideon's smile never reached his eyes. "Martha, Martha," he sighed, as if disappointed in a child. "You've been a thorn in my side from the beginning, but sending for those has been gunmen?" He clucked his tongue. "That's just poor business." "Seems like good business to me," Martha replied, chin raised defiantly. "Your boys didn't fare so well today." Gideon's hand moved faster than thought. The crack of his palm against Martha's face echoed through the silent saloon. Nobody moved. Nobody dared. "Burn it!" Gideon ordered, turning to his men. "Burn it all!" What followed was methodical destruction. The vultures smashed bottles, overturned tables, and doused everything in whiskey and lamp oil. Patrons were herded outside at gunpoint, forced to watch as flames began to lick at the walls of the Golden Nugget Saloon. Martha fought against the men holding her, tears streaming down her face as her livelihood, her home, became an inferno. Gideon approached her one last time, gripping her chin to force her eyes to his. "Tell your gunslingers this is just the beginning. Tomorrow it might be the general store. Next maybe the church. After that," his voice lowered to a whisper, "maybe I start with the children." He released her, mounting his horse as the saloon's roof began to collapse in a shower of sparks and burning timber. "Leave or die," he called out, his voice carrying over the roar of the flames. "That's my message to them, and to anyone who stands with them." The vultures rode away, silhouetted against the burning building like demons retreating to hell. From the shadows across the street, 3 pairs of eyes watched the destruction. The gunslingers had arrived too late to prevent it, but just in time to witness Gideon's message. "This ends now," Jedediah growled, his iron hand clenched into a fist. Hollis placed a restraining hand on his arm. "Not like this, not outnumbered in the dark." Silas, as always, said nothing. But his eyes, reflecting the dancing flames, spoke volumes. "We hit him where it hurts," Jedediah said, his voice hard as flint. "His gold shipments." Dawn painted the canyon walls in hues of amber and gold as the gunslingers lay in wait. Intelligence gathered from Martha's connections had revealed Gideon's most valuable shipment would pass through Dead Man's Gulch. A narrow passage where even the most heavily armed convoy would be vulnerable. 6 riders escorting the wagon, Silas whispered, lowering his spyglass, plus the driver and shotgun. 8 total. Jedediah nodded, making final adjustments to his position behind a large boulder. Remember, we need one alive. Hollis checked his revolvers one last time. The former bounty hunter had spent the night in silent prayer, but now his eyes held the cold focus of the killer he once was. God may forgive them, he murmured, but I won't. The convoy appeared around the bend, right on schedule. A reinforced wagon flanked by armed riders, dust billowing behind them like a storm cloud. At their head rode Cyrus Snake Mulligan, Gideon's most trusted lieutenant, a man whose cruelty was matched only by his cunning. Silas took aim at the lead rider, his breathing slowing to an almost imperceptible rhythm. The first shot cracked through the canyon, echoing off the walls as the rider toppled from his saddle. What followed was chaos, orchestrated with deadly precision. Jedediah emerged from cover, revolvers blazing with methodical accuracy. 2 vultures fell before they could identify their attackers. Hollis circled behind, cutting off their retreat with a barrage that sent horses rearing and men diving for cover. Snake Mulligan bellowed orders, trying to form a defensive position around the wagon. But the gunslingers had chosen their ground too well. Crossfire from 3 directions left no safe refuge. The driver attempted to whip the horses into a gallop, but Silas's shot took him cleanly through the shoulder. The wagon slewed sideways, nearly toppling. Within minutes, it was over. 7 bodies lay scattered across the canyon floor. Only Snake Mulligan remained alive, pinned beneath his fallen horse, blood streaming from a gash across his forehead. Jedediah approached slowly, keeping his revolver trained on Mulligan as Hollis secured the gold shipment, and Silas kept watch from higher ground. "Gideon's planning something," Jedediah said, crouching beside the wounded man. "What is it?" Mulligan spat blood. "Kill me and be done with it, Iron Hand." Jedediah pressed the barrel of his gun against Mulligan's temple. "I'm not asking twice!" Fear flickered in Mulligan's eyes. "Tomorrow at noon," he gasped. "Gideon's bringing in 30 more men, plans to make an example. Burn the whole damn town if he has to." The town meeting in the church basement buzzed with tension. Every face showed the strain of living under the Vulture's boot. But something else flickered in their eyes now. A dangerous emotion for people long oppressed. Hope. "They'll kill us all for this," a shopkeeper protested, his voice cracking. "You've seen what they did to Martha's place." The saloon owner stood at the front beside the 3 gunslingers, her face still bearing the mark of Gideon's hand, but her spine straight as a ramrod. The charred remains of her livelihood couldn't break what decades on the frontier had forged. "They're planning to kill us anyway," Martha countered. "Tomorrow at noon. That's what Snake Mulligan told us." A heavy silence fell as the implications sank in. Jedediah stepped forward, his weathered face solemn in the lamplight. "We can't fight this battle for you," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the crowded room. 3 guns against 30? Those aren't odds even we can beat." Murmurs of despair rippled through the crowd until Jedediah continued. "But 30 against 50? Those are odds I'd take any day." Sheriff Tom Harlan pushed through the crowd, the ghost of his former authority returning to his stance. "I wore this badge for 15 years before the Vultures came," he said, producing his tarnished star from his pocket. "I was too much of a coward to die wearing it, but I'm not too much of a coward to take it back." Hollis nodded toward the sheriff. "Every man who can shoot needs a gun. Every woman who can't needs to be ready to help the wounded or put out fires." "Some of us haven't fired a gun in years," an elderly farmer objected. Silas, silent until now, stepped forward. "Then you'll learn again," he said simply. The church basement became an impromptu armory and training ground. Hollis demonstrated how to take cover effectively. Jedediah organized the townspeople into defensive positions. Silas worked with those who could shoot, refining their aim and teaching them to conserve ammunition. By midnight, Boomtown had transformed. Hidden barricades appeared at strategic points. Women melted family silverware into bullets. Children carried messages between groups preparing defenses. Sheriff Harlan pinned his badge to his chest, checking the action on his revolver with steady hands. "Never thought I'd wear this again," he said to Jedediah. "Wear it proudly tomorrow," the gunslinger replied. "You've earned it back." As dawn approached, a Vulture spy observed the preparations from a distant rooftop before slipping away to deliver news to Gideon. Boomtown was no longer easy prey. High noon approached with the inevitability of Judgment Day. The sun hung mercilessly overhead, baking the dusty main street as townsfolk took their positions behind barricades, in second-story windows, and on rooftops. Hands trembled on unfamiliar weapons, but eyes remained resolute. "They're coming!" a lookout called from the church bell tower. The thunder of hooves grew from distant rumble to imminent threat. Gideon Blackwell led the charge, resplendent in a black duster that billowed behind him like dark wings. True to Mulligan's word, at least 30 riders followed. Hardened killers drawn by the promise of blood and gold. "Ready!" Jedediah bellowed from his position at the center of town. Rifles and shotguns appeared at windows. Revolvers were cocked behind overturned wagons. Gideon reined his horse to a halt at the edge of town, his cold eyes surveying the makeshift defenses with contempt. "This is your last chance!" he called out, his voice carrying in the desert air. "Surrender the gunslingers and 20% of your business's earnings, and the rest of you may live." The town's answer came in the form of a single rifle shot from the bell tower. The bullet kicked up dust inches from Gideon's horse, causing the animal to rear nervously. Gideon's face contorted with fury. "Kill them all!" he roared, spurring his horse forward. The Vultures charged as one, guns blazing. The first wave met a hail of gunfire from the defenders. Horses screamed and fell. Men died in the dust. But the Vultures' superior numbers began to tell as they pushed deeper into town, forcing the defenders to fall back. Brutus the Bear slayed, Gideon's hulking enforcer, smashed through a barricade with sheer brute force, sending townspeople scattering. Jedediah intercepted him, iron hand connecting with Brutus's jaw in a blow that would have felled a normal man. Brutus merely staggered before launching himself at the gunslinger. Their fight became a brutal dance of fists and knives as they crashed through the general store window, sending glass and merchandise flying. On the south side, Hollis found himself defending Martha's position as Vultures flanked the main resistance. He emptied both revolvers into the attackers, then drew a hidden derringer as a Vulture lunged at Martha with a knife. "Not today," Hollis growled, his shot taking the attacker between the eyes. Silas moved like a ghost through the chaos, each shot finding its mark with deadly precision. When his ammunition ran low, he recovered weapons from the fallen, never staying in one position long enough to become a target. Sheriff Harlan rallied a group of miners at the bank, holding the line against overwhelming odds. His badge caught the sunlight as he stood tall, finally becoming the lawman he'd once been. Gradually, impossibly, the tide began to turn. Gideon Blackwell was no fool. As the battle turned against his Vultures, he signaled a tactical retreat, leading his remaining men toward the abandoned gold mine that pockmarked the hillside beyond town. The dark mouth of the main shaft swallowed them like some ancient beast consuming its young. "He's running!" Sheriff Harlan shouted, blood streaming from a gash above his eye. Jedediah, breathing heavily from his brutal encounter with Brutus, whom he'd finally managed to incapacitate with a crushing blow from his iron hand, shook his head grimly. Not running, regrouping. That mine's a fortress, hundreds of tunnels, chambers, dead ends. He knows we'll follow. "It's a trap," Martha said, binding a wounded townsman's arm with strips torn from her apron. "Of course it is," Hollis agreed, reloading his revolvers with practiced efficiency. "But if we don't finish this now, he'll be back with more men." Silas appeared silently beside them, his face streaked with gunpowder and sweat. He simply nodded toward the mine, his meaning clear. Gideon couldn't be allowed to escape. "We go in," Jedediah decided. Sheriff, keep your people here. Tend the wounded, secure the town. This part's for us." The three gunslingers approached the mine entrance cautiously, aware of eyes watching from the darkness. The temperature dropped noticeably as they stepped inside, the sounds of the battle fading behind them. Lanterns hung at irregular intervals, casting ghostly shadows that danced across the rough-hewn walls. "Been a while since I hunted a man through a hole in the ground," Hollis muttered, his voice echoing slightly in the confined space. They moved deeper, passing support beams that groaned under the weight of the mountain above. Water dripped somewhere in the darkness beyond their vision. The mine was a labyrinth. Tunnels branched in all directions, some barely wide enough for a man to pass sideways. The first trap sprung 20 yards in, a tripwire that sent a volley of arrows whistling through the darkness. Jedediah shouted a warning, but Silas was a step ahead, dropping flat as the projectiles embedded themselves in the wooden support beam behind them. "Careful," Jedediah warned unnecessarily. They proceeded more cautiously, checking each step. Another 50 yards brought them to a chamber where 3 tunnels diverged. "We should split up," Hollis suggested. Jedediah shook his head. That's what he wants. A shot rang out from the leftmost tunnel, the bullet sparking off rock inches from Jedediah's head. Silas responded instantly, his return fire disappearing into the darkness. A cry of pain confirmed he'd found his target. They advanced toward the sound, but as they entered the narrow passage, a rumbling began overhead. "Cave in!" Jedediah shouted as the ceiling began to collapse. Silas shoved Jedediah forward with surprising strength as tons of rock and timber crashed down. When the dust settled, Silas lay half-buried in debris, blood soaking through his shirt. "Ain't letting you die yet," he rasped, his voice barely audible. Jedediah and Hollis worked frantically to free Silas from the debris. The sharpshooter's breathing came in labored gasps, but his eyes remained clear and focused. "Leave me," he managed. "Finish it." "Not a chance," Jedediah growled, leveraging a timber with his iron hand. When they finally extracted him, Silas's leg was badly crushed. Hollis fashioned a crude splint and helped prop him against the wall. "I'll slow you down," Silas insisted. Jedediah pressed one of his revolvers into Silas's hand. "Cover our exit. Anyone comes back through here that isn't us, you make them regret it." Silas nodded, positioning himself with a clear line of fire down the tunnel. The old sharpshooter's hands were steady despite his injury. A wounded whisper was still deadlier than most men in their prime. Jedediah and Hollis pressed deeper into the mine, more cautious now. The tunnels grew narrower, the air thicker with dust and the metallic tang of minerals. Occasional sounds echoed through the darkness. A distant footfall, the clink of metal on stone. A whispered order. "We're close," Hollis murmured. The passage suddenly widened into a large chamber supported by massive timbers. Dusty mining equipment cast monstrous shadows in the lantern light. At the center stood Gideon Blackwell, his black duster discarded, a revolver in each hand. "Iron Hand and the Preacher," he said, his voice calm despite the trickle of blood running from his temple. "I knew it would come to this." Jedediah and Hollis spread out, making themselves harder targets. "Your men are dead or scattered, Gideon," Jedediah said. "It's over." Gideon's laugh echoed off the stone walls. "Over? This was never just about Boomtown. There are a dozen settlements ripe for picking. I lose a few men, I gain more." "Not this time," Hollis replied. "Word's already spreading about what happened here today." Gideon's eyes narrowed as they fixed on Hollis. "The great preacher Boone," he sneered. "Tell me, how many men did you send to their graves before you found religion? 50? 100? Hollis stiffened. "I know all about you," Gideon continued. "The bounties you collected, the men you tracked through blizzards, the families you destroyed. You're no better than I am, just older and too weak to admit what you really are." "Difference is," Hollis replied, his voice steady, "I'm trying to make amends." Tension crackled between them like lightning before a storm. Gideon's fingers twitched near his revolvers. "One last chance," Jedediah offered. "Surrender and face justice." Gideon's response was a blur of movement as he drew and fired in one fluid motion. The bullet grazed Jedediah's shoulder, spinning him half around. Hollis returned fire, forcing Gideon behind a rusted ore cart. The chamber erupted in gunfire, muzzle flashes illuminating the darkness like lightning. Bullets ricocheted off stone and metal, raising sparks and dust. When the echoes faded, all three men were wounded but still standing. Gideon's right arm hung useless at his side, but his left hand still gripped a smoking revolver. "Now," Jedediah said quietly, "we end this." Jedediah and Gideon faced each other like duelists of old, each measuring the other for weakness. Blood seeped through Jedediah's shirt where Gideon's bullet had grazed him, but his iron hand remained steady on his revolver. "You know what your mistake was, Blackwell?" Jedediah asked, his voice echoing in the chamber. Gideon's eyes narrowed. "Enlighten me, old man." "You thought fear was power, but fear only works until something more powerful comes along." Jedediah took a step forward. "Something like courage." Gideon's laugh was sharp and bitter. "Courage?" "Look around you. We're in a hole in the ground, bleeding and broken. What has your precious courage won you?" "Everything," Hollis interjected from the shadows. "It won us everything." The distraction was momentary, but enough. As Gideon's eyes flicked toward Hollis, Jedediah moved. His draw was blindingly fast, a blur of motion that defied his age. Gideon fired simultaneously, his bullet whistling past Jedediah's ear as the gunslinger's shot found its mark. Gideon staggered backward, a look of disbelief crossing his face as he pressed his hand against the spreading crimson stain on his chest. His legs buckled, sending him crashing against a support beam. The impact dislodged a shower of dust and small stones from the ceiling. A low groan reverberated through the chamber as ancient timbers shifted. "This whole place is coming down," Hollis warned, grabbing Jedediah's arm. Gideon slumped to the ground, his breathing ragged. "Fitting," he gasped. "If I go, I'm taking you with me." With his remaining strength, he fired into a key support beam. The crack of the shot was drowned out by the ominous splintering of wood. The mine's death groan intensified as the ceiling began to give way. "Run!" Jedediah shouted, pulling Hollis toward the tunnel they'd entered through. They sprinted through the collapsing passageway, dodging falling rocks and timber. The very mountain seemed to be swallowing itself, decades of precarious engineering finally surrendering to gravity and time. They found Silas where they'd left him, grimly holding his position despite his injuries. Jedediah hoisted the sharpshooter over his shoulder in a fireman's carry. "Gideon?" Silas managed to ask through gritted teeth. "Finished," Hollis confirmed, supporting them both as the tunnel behind them collapsed. The three gunslingers staggered through the mine's twisting passages, the destruction nipping at their heels. Support beams cracked like gunshots. Walls of stone that had stood for decades crumbled into rubble. They burst into sunlight just as the main entrance collapsed with a thunderous roar. A cloud of dust billowed out behind them, momentarily obscuring the town below. As the air cleared, they saw the townsfolk gathered at a safe distance, watching in awe. When they spotted the three figures emerging from the destruction, a cheer went up that seemed to shake the very mountains. "It's over," Jedediah said quietly, easing Silas to the ground where Martha and the town doctor rushed to attend to him. Hollis nodded, staring at the sealed mine entrance that had become Gideon Blackwell's tomb. "It's over." A week passed before Boomtown began to truly breathe again. The dead were buried with solemn reverence, both those who had fallen defending their homes and the vultures who had no one to claim them. Buildings damaged in the siege were under repair, the rhythmic sound of hammers and saws replacing gunfire. The gunslingers remained to see the healing begin. Silas recovered slowly, his shattered leg carefully tended by the town doctor. He bore the pain stoically, speaking little as always, but his eyes followed the town's rebirth with quiet satisfaction. Sheriff Tom Harlan walked the streets with renewed purpose, his badge polished to a shine. Deputies had been appointed from among those who had shown courage during the battle, men who understood the price of freedom and the responsibility that came with it. On a crisp morning, the three gunslingers gathered at the edge of town. Horses waited, saddlebags packed for journeys yet to come. A crowd had assembled to see them off. Nearly every resident of Boomtown stood in respectful silence as Martha Thompson approached the legendary trio. "You've given us back our lives," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "There's a place for each of you here, if you want it. Boomtown could use men like you to help rebuild." Jedediah adjusted his worn hat, squinting at the distant mountains. "Some men aren't meant to stay in one place too long, Martha. The quiet life doesn't fit everyone." "Where will you go?" Sheriff Harlan asked, stepping forward to shake Jedediah's hand. "There are other towns," Jedediah replied, clasping the sheriff's hand firmly. "Other people who need reminding that justice still exists in this world." Martha turned to Silas, who leaned heavily on a crutch carved from ash wood. "And you? Your leg needs time to heal properly." Silas gazed at her with those penetrating eyes that seemed to see more than they should. He shook his head slightly, the gesture eloquent in its simplicity. Whisper would remain true to his nature, a shadow passing through the world, leaving little trace but profound impact. "I understand," Martha said. Through her eyes glistened with unshed tears. Hollis stood apart, his expression troubled as he stared at the steeple of Boomtown's small church. The former bounty hunter had been uncharacteristically quiet since the mine collapsed, as though wrestling with demons only he could see. "Hollis?" Martha prompted gently. He turned, resolution settling over his features like a physical transformation. "I think I'll stay," he said, surprising them all. "This town could use a preacher, a real one." Jedediah's eyebrows raised, but a faint smile tugged at his lips. "Found your redemption at last, preacher?" "Started to," Hollis corrected. "There's still a long road ahead." The two men clasped forearms, decades of complex history passing between them in a single look. No words were needed. They had fought together, bled together, and in doing so had laid old grievances to rest. Silas approached, grasping each of their shoulders in turn. The gesture spoke volumes from a man of so few words. One by one, the townspeople came forward to shake hands, offer thanks, or simply touch the men who had become living legends before their eyes. Children gazed up in wonder, creating memories they would recount to their own children decades hence. As the sun climbed higher, Jedediah mounted his horse with the fluid grace of a man who had spent more time in the saddle than out of it. Silas followed suit, his movements careful but determined despite his injury. They rode out without looking back, two silhouettes gradually diminishing against the vast landscape. Behind them, Boomtown stood renewed, not just rebuilt, but reforged through fire into something stronger than before. And in the saloon that night, the first stories were already being told of the day three legendary gunslingers brought justice back to a town that had forgotten its meaning. If this story keeps you on the edge of your seat, you won't want to miss what happens in the next video. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss out on the next frontier adventure.